I have a Poulan model 2150 chainsaw that will not start. It's getting fuel and it has good spark, so I'm going to check the compression. First I'm going to remove this cover. It's held on by 3 screws, and I'm going to use a Torx driver to remove them. Next I'm going to remove the spark plug cable. That just pops right off. And now I'm going to remove the spark plug. Then I'm going to use a compression tester to check the compression. And that just screws right into the spark plug hole. Once you have the tester installed, just pull the rope several times and watch the needle on the tester. When the needle stops moving, that's what your compression is. On these particular models, they should be a minimum of about 100 to 115 psi. They generally won't run if they're under 100. You can see this one is about maybe 25 psi, so this has barely any compression at all. I'm going to remove the muffler so I can take a look at the piston, and that's held on by these 2 bolts. Behind the muffler is this shield. It may not come off with the muffler. So now with the muffler removed, you can see the piston, and it looks like it's very scored. It's pretty rough, and it's sitting in there a little sloppy. See it wobbling around. So I'm going to finish taking this apart, take the cylinder off so I can get the piston out. I'm going to take this side cover off with these 2 nuts, and then I can remove the bar and the chain. Next I'm going to remove the cover for the starter. And that is held on by 4 screws, and again uses a Torx driver. Next I'm going to remove the handle. There's a couple of screws on the bottom and 2 more on the side. Now I'm just going to take out the air filter, and I'll remove this cover from the carburetor. Now I'm going to remove the carburetor. There are a couple of fuel lines that you'll have to disconnect. One on that side, and then there's one down here which is probably easier to remove from this ball here. There's one down here. And I'm just going to lift the choke up out of the way, and then make sure these studs are pushed in, and you can slip the carburetor off. And you just have to disconnect this cable yet. And there's a ground cable down here that you'll want to disconnect. Down here in the bottom, just take this screw out. Once you have that screw out, there's a spring clip that sits against the off switch. Just make sure they'll stay together. On the side of the cylinder, there's a spring clip that holds the spark plug wire on. So I'm just going to pop that off. Now I'm going to take the flywheel off. And to loosen this nut, there's really nothing to grab onto on the other side. So one way to keep this from rotating is to just feed a bit of rope down into the cylinder, and that way when the piston comes up against it, it just squishes the rope and it won't damage anything. So just turn your flywheel till the piston is on bottom, and then just fill this with rope. So now when I go to break this nut loose, the piston's up against the rope and it won't turn, and you can easily loosen that nut. So the flywheel has a slight press on it. So you just want to loosen this nut till it's just past the stud on here, and then put a socket up against this nut and tap it with a hammer, and that should knock the flywheel loose. And then be sure and turn the flywheels so the magnets are away from the magneto, otherwise it's going to stick to them. And now I'm going to take the clutch off of the other side. And we'll leave the rope in here because we have the same case where we need to hold this tight while we loosen the clutch. And this clutch has left-hand threads, and if you can see that, it even says off with an arrow pointing to the direction that you have to turn it to remove it. There is a special tool to remove this. It's a cylinder with a couple of pins in it that fit in here, and then it's got a lug on the end to put a socket on. If you don't have that tool, you can maybe use a channel locks or something else. You just don't want to damage this. So I just made my own tool to remove this. I just took a piece of aluminum. I drilled a couple holes in it, 1/4 inch holes on 1 inch centers, and I put a couple of roll pins in there, and that should fit right over the top of there. And then I just used an adjustable wrench on there, and I was able to break it loose. Next I'm going to remove this oil pump First I'll get the shield out of the way because it's covering it. And be sure to remove this washer that goes behind the clutch. Then there's two Phillips screws that hold this oil pump on. And then you can remove the oil pump. So now on the bottom of the chainsaw there's these 4 bolts which go through the crankcase and hold the cylinder on. So I'm going to remove those. So now with those out, I should be able to remove the cylinder from the assembly. Now I'm going to pry the crankcase away from the cylinder. And now I can pop the crankshaft and the piston out of the cylinder. Now you can see how scored this piston is. It is really grooved. And you see the ring in here that should spring open. And on this side, it's so scored it can't even move. So it's completely pressed into that groove in the piston and didn't allow it to expand, and that's where we're losing all our compression. And that cylinder looks really rough down here. You can really feel the grooves in there. So I think to repair this I'm going to have to replace the cylinder and the piston. Next I'm going to remove the piston from the connecting rod. The piston pivots on this wrist pin, so you have to remove that. The wrist pin is held in place with this little spring clip wire. On one side of the piston there's a little notch. You can get a screwdriver in to pry that spring clip out. So just rotate that spring clip around until the end is near that notch and then pry it out. And then you can push the wrist pin out from the other side. If you need to use a punch to force it out, you should support the piston on a block of wood. You don't want to put any force on this connecting rod or you may damage it. If the pin's pretty tight, you might have to tap it with a hammer to knock it out. Here's the piston once I had it cleaned up. This is the exhaust port side of the piston, and you can see how badly this is scored. And here's the intake side, and it's still fairly smooth. And you can see the ring here should be able to expand so it's always in contact with the cylinder. But on the exhaust side, it's scored so badly, the ring is embedded into the piston and not allowed to move. So the compression is just blowing right by here, and that's why it's so low. And here's the cylinder, and you can see on the exhaust side it's extremely scored also, and still pretty smooth on the intake side. I received the new cylinder and piston kit. The new piston has 2 grooves for rings instead of 1 like the original. I'm going to start by putting the lower ring into the piston. On the piston there's a little pin at the top of the groove, and on the ring there are cutouts, and I'm going to put those towards the top so they match up with that pin in the piston. I'm going to start by putting one end into the groove and then just working the ring around, pressing it onto the piston. And you can see when it squeezes together, those 2 cutouts will match up with that pin. And then I'm going to do the same with the second ring, making sure the cutouts are towards the top to match the pin, and start it in the groove and then just work it around, pressing it on. The new piston came with new spring clips, so I'm going to install one on one side of the piston. The new clips are shaped a little different, so I'm going to use this needle nose pliers and hold by this part of the wire. So I'm going to put this part into the groove and push in as I turn and force the wire into the groove. And you want to make sure that it's seated all around in that groove. Next I'm going to install the piston and the wrist pin onto the connecting rod. The way this was originally, here's the taper for the flywheel. So when the crankshaft is laying like this, these pins in the piston were facing up. So I'm going to install it back the same way it was removed. So I put a little oil on the wrist pin, and then I'm going to start it into the piston so it's partially in there, and then I will put the connecting rod in the piston and push the pin the rest of the way through. And just push that pin in all the way until it hits against that spring clip. And now I'm going to install the spring clip on the other side of the piston. And again, make sure that it's seated in the groove all around. Next I'm going to install the carburetor mount onto the new cylinder. Next I'm going to install a light bead of gasket maker on the cylinder on each side where the bearing goes for the crankshaft. I'm also going to put a small bead on the crankcase. And now I'm going to place the crankshaft assembly and piston into the cylinder. I have the carb mount facing forward. The worm gear for the oil pump is on the left, and the tapered part for the flywheel is on the right. Before I put this in, I want to put some oil on the piston so it's lubed up for the first time it gets started. Before you put the piston in, make sure that the rings are properly located on each side of the pins. And the cylinder has a taper at the beginning to force the rings closed so it can go into the cylinder. And then make sure the crankshaft seals are seated properly into the cylinder. And now I'm going to put the crankcase on the cylinder. Now I'm going to put the cylinder assembly into the chainsaw housing. On this side is the coil, so the crankshaft side with the taper will go on this side. The other side of the crankshaft with the worm gear for the oil pump will go through this slot. And you want to hold this crankcase on so it doesn't fall off while you're installing it. And now, while holding the whole assembly together, replace the bolts in the bottom. And now you want to tighten these bolts, just hand tight, just enough to squeeze some of the gasket maker out, but not fully tighten it. Once it starts squeezing the gasket maker, then you want to let it sit for 1 hour and then finish tightening. So you can see some of the gasket maker has started to squeeze out, so I'm going to stop there and let it sit for 1 hour and then finish tightening, and that'll give it a good seal. After an hour, tighten the bolts between 110 and 140 inch-pounds. Next, I'm going to replace the oil pump. And now slip the bar plate over the studs, and then replace the washer behind the clutch. and then put the clutch on. Next I'm going to put the flywheel on. On the back side of the flywheel is a key that's molded into the casting, and that will fit into this keyway in the crankshaft. So you want to line that up. Next, put the washer on the shaft over the flywheel. This is a spring washer. It's slightly concave on one side. This acts as a lock washer, and that side should go down. And then put the nut on. The nut should be torqued 12 to 14 foot-pounds. And then replace the clip on the side of the cylinder that holds these wires in place. And that should just snap on. And next I'm going to replace this spring clip that holds this ground wire in place and the on switch. Now I'm going to install the carburetor. Connect the throttle linkage and then slide it over the two studs. And then put the choke grommet back in the housing and connect the fuel lines. And this lower fuel line connects to the primer bulb. And you want to make sure this throttle linkage is behind this lower fuel line, otherwise it'll bind. And now I'm going to put the air cleaner on the carburetor. And replace the two nuts. And then the air filter. Since the cylinder assembly was out of the chainsaw, the air gap between the coil and the magnets on the flywheel probably isn't correct. So you'll want to adjust that. So just loosen these two screws on the coil and then pull this all the way back and rotate the flywheel until the magnets line up. And if you don't have a gauge, you can use a business card or heavy paper of similar thickness and slip it between the coil and the magnets. Once you have that slipped in there, that should set it about the correct gap. And then just tighten the screws on the coil. And then you can slip the paper out. I'm going to put the handle back on. It's easiest to slip the bottom into this slot first, and then You may have to pry it open a little bit to get the other side lined up. The longer screws go on the bottom and the shorter screws go on the side. Now I'm going to replace the cover with the pull rope. So now I've replaced the bar and the chain, and I'm going to put the cover on. On the front of the cover is a screw for adjusting the chain tension, and there's a little tab here on the screw, and that needs to go in this hole in the bar. So when you adjust the screw, it adjusts the tension on the chain. So once you have that cover in place, then you can replace the nuts on the cover. And just get those finger tight until you've adjusted the tension on the chain, and then tighten the nuts. On the cover there's a symbol of the chain, so you make sure you have it going in the right direction. Next I'm going to replace this muffler shield. And then the muffler. And then tighten the two screws. And they should be torqued to 90 to 100 inch-pounds. And then I'm going to replace the spark plug. And spark plug cable. And then the top cover. The top cover should sit down easily. If it doesn't, make sure the spark plug wire is not getting pinched between the cover and the cylinder. And then tighten the screws. Ideally, you should wait 24 hours for the gasket maker to set on the cylinder before starting, and then make sure you have the correct fuel oil mixture so you don't ruin the piston. I'll show you a view of what this piston looks like under a microscope.